Are there any three letters more critical and more divisive in the business world right now than DEI? I don't think I've actually ever met someone who doesn't have a strong reaction to this term and the word, positive or negative. I can imagine that by virtue of this episode being about DEI, we may have already lost some listeners.
Words without action can be worse than saying nothing at all.
I think not assuming silence means lack of support is actually really powerful. If you are going to judge based on action, not just on words. I think that, action backing up statements is really what builds trust.
If a term carries too much baggage, I think we can talk about it in other ways.
So my guest today authored a piece for Fortune earlier this year that caught my attention with a very telling headline. The anti-DEI movement has gone from fringe to mainstream. And in it, she explores how the term DEI has become weaponized and why we need to be precise about the issues DEI can address. My guest is Joelle Emerson, the co-founder and CEO at Paradigm, a company that helps other companies create the kind of culture where people from all backgrounds and identities can do their best work. Paradigm's worked with over 1,000 organizations to develop representative teams and fair talent systems and processes, ultimately building inclusive cultures that boost engagement, performance, and retention. Joelle is a former civil rights lawyer, but she moved into the diversity, equity, and inclusion space with the launch of Paradigm. She saw working directly with companies as a way to address the root causes of reform or courtroom battles around equal pay and other workplace protections for women and marginalized groups. So after 10 years, Joelle has perhaps seen it all from hashtag Me Too to the stampede toward DEI in 2020, and then the growing DEI backlash, which is now moving into the mainstream. Joelle's watching the latest trends and legislative developments closely. So I'm really excited to have Joelle here today to talk about it all. Joelle, welcome.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for establishing the landscape so effectively. That was great.
Awesome. I'm glad I met your bar. I can imagine that by virtue of this episode being about DEI, we may have already lost some listeners. I don't think I've actually ever met someone who doesn't have a strong reaction to this term and the work, positive or negative. And even those who are really strong believers and proponents of DEI, I'm finding they're fatigued and kind of burnt out. And so oftentimes, I found that when, you give people a minute to talk about what DEI really means to them, you can actually be surprised. So to start, I wanted to just ask you, can you share your definition of DEI? And like, not just the letters, obviously, but what does it really mean?
This is one of my favorite things to talk about. And I'm really glad you asked because, at its core, DEI, and people can call this different things, is really about creating representative workplaces where everyone has a fair chance to do their best work and thrive. I think that using an acronym, any acronym really, can actually be pretty unhelpful. And I think it's unhelpful to the efforts that we are trying to drive around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because as you mentioned, a lot of people don't really understand exactly what it means. And I think when you just throw three letters together, people can sort of import their own definitions onto that without anyone really being able to dispute that. So it's very easy for me to say DEI means these things, and you can't really dispute that because it's just three letters without a lot of inherent meaning. So I actually think it is really important to step back and look at what each letter is all about substantively, like not just a definition, but like what do we mean when we say diversity? What do we mean when we say equity? What do we mean when we say inclusion? Because these are actually three distinct concepts. That's another reason why I think it's unhelpful to put them all together and act as though they mean a single thing, because they actually mean three different things and things that I think taken collectively can help us create better organizations in ways that we can talk about, but I think are not universally understood. And if there's one thing I've learned over the last couple of years, it's that, wow, a lot of us might have assumed that everyone sort of knew what we meant when we said DEI. And actually, a lot of people didn't know what we meant. And I think that sort of opens the term up to, you know, anyone adding their own definition and being pretty persuasive about it. So when I say diversity, I think when most people say diversity, what I mean is, casting a wide net for talent to find a more representative group of skilled candidates. Now, I think that's important for a lot of reasons. I think it's important if you want your workforce to reflect the customer base you serve. I think it's important if you want your workforce to reflect the communities that you operate within. And I think for most companies, it's important if you start to look at trends around workforce demographics, if you just want to be able to hire enough people in the coming 3 years, 5 years, decade, it will be important to be able to figure out how do we cast a wide net for talent? How do we attract the best people from all backgrounds? Equity, probably the most misunderstood of the three letters. I think about it as fairness would be like the best word I might use in place of equity if I had to replace that that word with just another that describes similar concept. Really, it's about designing systems and processes that enable people from all backgrounds to have a fair opportunity to do their best. A lot of leaders like to talk about meritocracy and designing meritocratic companies. And obviously, that's a great ideal to strive for. But if you look at your existing systems and processes, you're likely to find that there's a whole lot of bias standing in the way of that. People who, hire someone that they used to work with, or a friend of their family, or someone getting a promotion because they have a social relationship with their manager. Those are just examples of things that are standing in the way of meritocracy and are very much not equitable. So, equity is how do we make those things more fair so that we can actually know that we're hiring the best people, we're promoting the best people because we're taking out some of those biases that stand in the way. And then inclusion is about, creating experiences at work, creating cultures where people can be their true selves, where people can be their best selves, which is critical to unlocking performance. If we want people to perform their best, we have to figure out under what circumstances can people be their best selves at work. And I think most people, the vast majority, I believe, I'm a optimist, but I really believe the vast majority of people agree that all three of those things, the way that I just described them, matter. I think the vast majority of people are values aligned, that those things are better for organizations and for the world. And so I think it's really important that when we're talking about this topic, we start, as you've done, by defining what we're talking about. I'm sure there are definitely extremist groups that don't believe in those things, but I think the vast majority of people do.
Yeah, I think that's I mean, you said so many things that I just love to pull threads on, but, I think it's the one thing I did wanna pull a thread on just really quickly was, the referring, from your network. I think a lot of people are really struck by, "Oh, wait a minute, that could actually introduce bias." It's like, yeah, think about your economic class, think about your education, think about all of that, and so where so many companies had referral programs that were promoting that, I think it's such an interesting dimension that a lot of people don't think about. But I really loved what you said about like how we project our own um, definitions and potentially even values onto acronyms. It's funny because in our culture, we have a ban against acronyms because,
I love that.
um,
It's great.
yeah,
For
yeah.
that
Well,
reason,
and
right? Nobody knows what it means.
nobody knows what it means, and it creates an insider group of people who do. It's like and other people don't. And so it's actually like an inclusion principle, not to use acronyms. But I think that concept of people projecting, onto DEI, I'd be really curious just to pull on that thread a bit, which is, to understand what you've seen as the most common misperception about DEI.
There are many. I think two that I've noticed standing out a lot over the past year or so, and you know, historical misperception that I've seen just bubbling up a lot more. Um, One big one is that this work, call it DEI, call it DNI, which is what it used to be called. These terms have evolved a lot, even in the decade I've been focused on this. That it gives unfair advantages to some groups at the expense of others. So that, for example, if we create a mentoring program focused on women, that's actually giving women an unfair advantage that men in that organization are not getting. And that's just not true. And we have a lot of data to show why that's not true. And this is one of the reasons that I advocate for organizations to really be data driven in their efforts, because in the absence of data, that actually kind of might make sense. Like, that does seem unfair. Why do women get into this program that I don't get access? That is unfair. But when organizations do collect data, analyze data, talk about data, we start to see a different story emerge. For example, in most companies, we see, and I'm using gender as an example here, but there's different patterns across all sorts of different identity groups. We see, for example, that in many organizations, most organizations that I've looked at, um, women tend to be less well networked to senior executives. So women tend to have fewer strong connections to senior leaders in an organization. And in many companies, that tends to have an impact on growth trajectory. And so often when organizations create things like mentoring programs or sponsorship programs, it is not to give women an unfair leg up. It's to try to create a more level playing field. Because if we know that women aren't going to get those types of informal connections, let's try to programatize that to try to close that gap a little bit. And what we typically find is even in the best of program, it doesn't even close the gap. The network connections still aren't as strong, but it starts to chip away at that unfairness so that, again, we can create more meritocratic outcomes. If we actually want to promote the best people, we have to make sure we're not overlooking those people or failing to give those people a type of visibility that would actually allow them to do their best and bring their best to the table. So that's, a
Mm.
huge misconception. Or when we think about DEI hiring efforts, I think the assumption is often, well, this is about hiring less qualified candidates from underrepresented backgrounds instead of more qualified candidates from majority groups, which, by the way, would not be in the economic interest of any company to do. And I always think, wow, if companies are doing that, they're really still doing such a poor job. They're closing these numbers like so incrementally, so slowly. Really, what it's about is designing processes that are better for everyone and that are better for companies. So if we think about what it takes to mitigate bias in hiring, usually it's things like, let's make sure that we're asking more consistent questions of all candidates so that we can really compare people apples to oranges. That doesn't just help people from underrepresented racial or ethnic or gender backgrounds. It also just ensures that the candidate who isn't a friend of the hiring manager has a better shot at getting hired. It helps ensure that people who didn't just happen to go to the same college or university that the interview panel went to have a chance to get hired. So these practices, they help us identify, hire, promote the best people, and they help us make sure that we're also being more fair and considering a wider set of people. So, um, you know, I think we really need to push back against that narrative with data. And I'm not saying, by the way, that there's no company that has ever done this poorly. Like, I'm sure there are examples out there of companies giving unfair advantages, but we can't use anecdotes to prove, to disprove data. There's a ton of data that shows that what these efforts are about is creating a more level playing field so that people have a more fair chance to be considered and to do their best work. The other huge kind of misperception that I see is that diversity and equity and inclusion efforts are sort of a moral or social justice issue, which they are for many people. And there certainly is a moral imperative. I believe that. Many people believe that, to be fair. Um, but I think people often miss that it's a really existential business question for any company that wants to be effective over the decade to come. As I alluded to earlier, the workforce is becoming more diverse across a range of dimensions. And if companies want to succeed and sort of future proof their organizations, they're going to have to figure out what to do about that. So we know, for example, that, people globally, younger generations are more likely to identify as members of the LGBTQ community, as neurodivergent. In some countries, like the US, Canada, many parts of the world, more likely to identify as people of color. So we have this increasingly diverse sort of workforce to draw from. And we found in our data paradigm that companies are just not prepared for that. So we recently looked at data from 2 million job candidates, and we found that white candidates are almost twice as likely to be hired than candidates of any other racial or ethnic background. We
Wow.
also found that people of color, LGBTQ plus employees, and veterans, among other underrepresented groups, are having worse experiences at work. They're less likely to feel that decisions are fair, to feel they have a voice, to feel like they belong. So if companies don't change their status quo, they're going to have a very hard time in the years ahead hiring and retaining just people, the best people, even agnostic of identity, because there's this workforce that has rapidly changing demographics. Um, and on the other side of the coin, those are all the challenges. We find that when people believe their company values diversity, it's similar to some of the data you
Yeah.
teed us up with. Um, People are 3 times more engaged when they believe they're in a company that values diversity. When companies invest in improving the experiences for underrepresented groups, you cited a really interesting stat at the beginning. I think around 90% of people think that these programs have benefited them. That's what we see in the data. We have worked with tons of companies where, when they have focused on addressing a gap in experience for a specific underrepresented group, let's say disabled employees, veterans, LGBTQ plus employees, Black employees, when they focus on closing a gap in experience for those underrepresented groups, they've actually found as a consequence that everyone's experience improves. Sentiment goes up across the board. So it's really the opposite of this zero sum kind of idea that anti-diversity extremists paint it to be. It's really a rising tide lifts all boats, right? When we can address the barriers that people from underrepresented groups have, we actually create cultures where everyone feels, performs better. And so I think these data should be sort of a wake up call for leaders that really should be paying attention to how do I build business practices that just ensure that over the years to come, I'm going to be attractive as an employer of choice to the best people in the market. But I'm going to be able to create a culture where when I bring people who are different from one another together, they can collaborate effectively. And then I'm going to keep the best people. That's really what I think this work is about. And anything that you believe other than that, I would say is a misperception.
Right. That's really powerful. And I can speak from experience, Joelle, on your comment around consistent use of questions and interviews. We switched over to that methodology in the last few years, and I have to say, well, it's way more efficient because you're you're using the same questions,
Yeah,
and
you
so you
don't have to
don't
go in
have.
each time and be like, what am I going to ask this candidate?
Yeah, exactly. But it really does allow you to assess the candidates way more consistently. You know exactly what their responses would be to certain conditions or certain scenarios that you throw at them. So it's actually more helpful.
It is. The first time I read about this strategy, structured hiring, it was in a book called Work Rules by Laszlo Bock, former CHRO for many years at Google, and then founded a company called Humu, and just an amazing leader in this space. And he wasn't even talking about diversity. He was just talking about how do you make interviews more predictive of success? How do you hire the best people? And so it's really such a good example of how the same strategy you'd want to use for effective hiring is what you want to use if you want to have more inclusive hiring.
Yeah, and I think that just goes back to the point of when you design for certain underrepresented groups, you start removing barriers and putting in fairer processes, it actually benefits everybody, and I've really seen that, and I think the other thing we see is sentiment grows because people believe that there's actually fairness. And it's funny, I'm just reflecting on when I first joined Benevity, I met with the, founder and CEO, and one of the questions he asked me was, "What's a value that's really important to you?" And it was the first time I'd ever been asked that question actually in an interview, and I sat back and I was like, "Hmm," and I was like, "I think it's fairness."
Mm.
And, uh, and it's funny because I think if we talked about things as fairness, we could actually bridge, the gap a lot more on these 2 kinda sides of the debate.
I agree. I think it's a more universally understood word and concept. And then I think to get to sort of equity and what a lot of us think about when we think about equity, we have to talk about that the playing field isn't level before people get to your organization. And what do you make of that? And every company will have its own thinking to do about how it wants to conceive of that. But there's this great sort of analogy or thought experiment really by Stanford uh, psychology researcher and professor Greg Walton. And he says, imagine two runners running a race, and one is running against a headwind, and one is running in fair weather, and they finish the race at the same time. Who is the better runner, right? We would all agree that the person running against a headwind is the better runner. And so I believe that if you really want to identify talent, if you want to identify the best people within your organization, hire great people, promote the right people, ignoring circumstance is to your detriment. Like, actually being somewhat aware of the fact that people have different lived experiences, have moved through the world differently. Just being aware of that is, I think, one data point that can inform how you think about people. If you have two students and they were both, straight A students in college, and one had a full-time job and was on financial aid and was also an athlete, and the other had none of those things, like, we all think that, we all already kind of have some basic sort of awareness that people's different lived experiences obviously should shape how we think about them. Um, and so I don't actually think equity is that controversial. I think it only becomes controversial when we start to apply it to demographic identities, because there is so much, extremist desire to sort of keep the status quo. Like, there are so many extremist hate groups that are trying to confuse people about what equity is all about. And I'm just like, actually, equity is a principle we already use in so many areas of our lives that people are aligned on. But it's the term I'm a realist. And so I'm like, if a term carries too much baggage, I think we can talk about it in other ways. And I don't think that's threatening. I think we should be thinking about how do we communicate more effectively so that a wider set of people understand what we're talking about.
Well, Joelle, you went exactly where I want to go next, which is like, why do you think there is so much backlash? And maybe even the question is like, is there as much backlash as we might perceive? Like, I can't help but think that, politicians are using this to drive a bit of polarization or their own, driving their own advantage. News media is looking for clicks. So provocative things that kind of get our neurochemical balance off work. Social media algorithms are putting us into echo chambers or prioritizing highly quote unquote engaged, which is actually like polarizing content. Like I guess I'm just wondering like what is driving well, A, is the backlash real? And B, what do you think is driving it?
So I think there is a lot of backlash, and I think some of the articles about backlash are very overblown because I sometimes I read an article, I'm like, that's actually not what happened in that situation. So interesting. Um, but I think there are a lot. I don't think you could point to one single factor. I think first of all, it's important to acknowledge, you know, um, that in the United States, our sort of national history is one of civil rights progress followed by backlash. We have a sort of pendulum in the US that has, since our inception, swung back and forth. And, the way that this pendulums work is how far it swings in one direction predicts how far it swings in another. And that's true, every time we've made civil rights progress in this country, we've seen uh, uh, immediate efforts to dismantle and chip away at that progress. Now, in 2020 and 2021, we saw, really powerful sort of awakening around racial justice in this country, and the pendulum swung very, very far uh, in that direction. And I think companies doing a lot of things that didn't make a whole lot of sense, like making this their number one corporate agenda. That was never going to be sustainable. Companies have other corporate agendas, right? So companies did a lot of things, people did a lot of things that weren't sustainable, and I think now we're seeing the pendulum swing back in the other direction. And then I think there are a host of compounding factors, economic headwinds, geopolitical headwinds. There's a lot just that's been going on. But I think it's important to also, be clear that the backlash against DEI is, the result of a concerted multi-decade effort from conservative activists who have big ambitions. They don't just want to dismantle DEI as we now call it. They want to dismantle voting rights and a host of other civil rights laws that have been in place for at least a generation in the United States. So and this is well documented. This is not a conspiracy theory. These activists have written out their plans and published them and are proud of them. So I think it's critical that we don't lose sight of the fact that this is a concerted effort, and yet I think the circumstances that have allowed for that to gain so much steam are a result of this pendulum, economic headwinds, all the other some of the other things I mentioned. I think, um, you know, you said like how much of a backlash is there? I think a lot of the backlash is against the acronym DEI or this concept of wokeness that again I don't think people have a shared definition of. But I actually think, as you have said, and as so much data shows, the majority of people actually support these underlying concepts. There was a recent Washington Post poll that found that the majority of Americans support DEI, and they support it even more when we go beyond the acronym and talk about what these concepts are actually all about. So, and, I've seen some panics about this company laid off their DEI team, and I go look at it, I'm like, okay, they, you know, laid off 2 people and in 2020 they hired like 20 people. Maybe every company doesn't need 50-person DEI teams, and maybe in some cases it makes sense to recalibrate your efforts to actually figure out maybe this shouldn't actually be a thing that sits to the side of our organization. Maybe we should embed it more into the way our company operates. And I think some companies maybe are, using this as air cover to actually back off from their commitments, but I don't think we should interpret every change in corporate structure as giving up on DEI. And I think that just serves to sort of create this misperception that this work is being sort of taken apart in ways that are not aligning to the reality I see. And then, sort of, last thing I'll say is I'm sort of establishing the kind of main reasons I think this has happened. I do think one factor is um, I think over the last several years, as the pendulum was swinging so far in the direction towards conversations about and support of DEI, I think it's worth reflecting on, could those of us advocating for this work have done anything differently? Could we have left more room for good faith dialogue? Could we have done a better job allowing people to ask questions without sort of making people feel like the very act of asking those questions meant that they were somehow bad people? I think we didn't take enough time, and I have to say this even myself, reflecting on what I could have done differently. I wish I had spent more time explaining certain concepts rather than answering the questions I was asked. People were asking, let's talk about anti-racism. And in a lot of cases, you know, I think we were too quick to say, okay, let's talk about that, rather than to say, like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, why are we talking about this as an organization? Do you even have a shared understanding of what diversity is for you, or equity, or inclusion? Yes, we should talk about these things, but have we built the sort of foundation and infrastructure to have those conversations productively? And I'm not always sure we had. And so I think there's lessons for me and for those of us that really deeply care about this space, to think about, how do we make sure that we do everything we can when we know there's this, anti-diversity activists ready to attack and dismantle this work? How do we be as smart as we can about the way we communicate and approach this work to try and limit some of the negative impact that they're trying to have?
Yeah, I think there's so much in there, and I think I was, like, violently in agreement when you were talking about the pendulum swing, because I think that's really true, and I think practically speaking, it was unsustainable. And so that was gonna be one of the questions I asked, was just, like, we see all these headlines and data around, like, DEI related job postings have declined, like, 44% from the same time last year, or, DEI, mention I talked about this, DEI mentions and investor calls have dropped. I I am seeing that as you do DEI work, as you implement systems and processes into your company, the ideal state is actually not having DEI people. The ideal state is that the company operates with these systems in place, and that fairness is embedded in the structure of the organization, and that you're continually refreshing and keeping concepts top of mind around the culture and the behaviors of leaders. And so, like, I know some organizations got a lot of flack when they didn't hire a chief diversity officer coming out of 2020, but, in the way that I think you really wisely reflected on, like, what could I have done differently, those companies might actually be performing more consistently and more strongly because they maybe stayed the course, or other people had those mandates in their roles. And I know there was, like, a lot of interesting debate around, should it be that a CDO reports to a CHRO, or should the CHRO be the CDO? And, like, and there's just, but it's like, ultimately, it's just finding the most appropriate ways to embed it in your organization. So I don't know, I'm an optimist too, Joelle, so I choose to believe that these are not ill intentions when people are laying these teams off. I think that there's course corrections. And then I think the other piece is, people have different standards of what they believe is achievable in a company. And so someone in that role may feel as though, well, we didn't achieve the standard, like, we're not there. And other people have different perceptions of what the standard should be. So
And I think that's healthy, right? That's great. Like, let's disagree. Let's have more spaces where we disagree, and we don't use that to assume that one side or the other is not just wrong but bad. Like, I think we should have these debates. We should talk about, should there be a CDO, where should they sit, and not assume that because one party thinks you shouldn't have CDOs, you're, anti-diversity efforts. I also think it's often, you know, companies sometimes can't win. I think it's like, a lot of companies, were called out for performative DEI when they hired these teams, and now they're changing their structure, and now they're, against DEI. And I think that's all fine. And those are reasonable conversations to have. But I think at the end of the day, companies would do best to not get caught up in the public opinion, the zeitgeist of the moment too much, and evolve their efforts every time something changes around them. I think what's going to build more sustainable, resilient culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging efforts is to think, what does our organization need most? What is it going to look like for us to attract the best people from all backgrounds, to create cultures that unleash potential, to keep the best people, to create teams that collaborate across difference effectively. And if you can ground all of your efforts in that, then you're not going to need to swing your own efforts along with this back and forth pendulum, because you won't care so much what the outside attacks are. You'll just be able to say, like, as Jamie Dimon, I think, has done really effectively, like, okay, like, we're going to keep doing this. Yes, we're not going to change. And I think so
Yeah.
many companies have been so concerned with moving their efforts along with the changing social or political or whatever wins, that it's just really thrashy. And so I think now is a very good time actually for organizations to step back and say, is the way that we've been doing this work driving the kind of progress we want to see? If it is, let's keep doing it. If it's not, let's be willing to evolve it. Not, though, in a way that's reactive or responsive to extremist groups. You can't please them. Like, the idea of changing your acronym to somehow outrun hate groups, like, they'll just pick on whatever your new acronym is. That is unstrategic. But how do you best serve your own interests? How do you communicate this work effectively to your employees? How do you set up an organizational structure around this work? And by the way, I think different org structures can work. I think you can have a CDO. I think you cannot have a CDO. I think both can be okay. How do you do what makes sense for your organization and be clear on why you're doing it, so that you just don't get caught up in what's going to be a continued back and forth dialogue?
Yeah, so I love that you're bringing this up, right? Because I think it's a question of identity. Like, who are you as a company? What are your values? What are your anchor points versus this real compulsion to be what consumers or employees or investors or the general public want you to be. And so I don't know if you're alluding to this. I want to talk about the headlines about companies who have been changing their stance of it, right? And listen, no judgment here. I think this is really tough to navigate
I
when
might
you're in
have
the
some
hot seat.
judgment.
Yeah.
Some judgment.
Comcast opened the eligibility of a grant originally aimed at women and people of color, and they opened it up to all small business owners and entrepreneurs. And so I'm curious. I can understand a business making business decisions. Like that's not my point. I'm just curious about the different ways that companies are leading through this maelstrom, and like, is there a pattern in some industries? Like, is there a profile of the companies that are acting maybe more cautiously and pulling back, or that are more susceptible to the brand and reputation or the extremist hate groups? Or, and then are there some that are just good at staying course? Is this a leadership thing? Is it an industry thing? Like, what is there a pattern, Joelle?
Some companies are going to be evolving their efforts with a focus on how do we make these efforts more resilient to outside challenges, so that we can protect them, so we can protect our focus on inclusion. I think other organizations are so unclear in the reason that they were doing this work in the first place. But Comcast, the way that I understand what they did is, opening up eligibility requirements. I can understand, the frustration that undermines the intent of the program. We're not seeing white men struggle to progress at the same rate as women, as people of color, but there is an evolving legal landscape that companies should be paying attention to if they want to strengthen their inclusion programs. And I think the affirmative action decision, uh, you know, gives companies a reasonable kind of um, uh, reason to question whether programs that are only open to certain groups are going to make them the target of an external attack. And once you're the target of an external attack, that creates a lot of risk. It could create new case law that actually hurts other companies. It could lead to other programs that you have, being under attack. So I think being responsive to the evolving legal landscape is not only smart from a protecting your business standpoint, you have to do that. It actually is helpful for making your inclusion efforts more resilient. We don't want these things to be torn apart in the courts, right? So being thoughtful, and what the Supreme Court said in the affirmative action decision is you can still do things like have application processes where people have to articulate why, for example, they you know might not have as much access to funding for their small business, and you're probably going to disproportionately, if you have run that process well, uh, select people from underrepresented backgrounds. Now, by the way, I think the affirmative action decision was misguided, and I think all of this follow-on litigation is very deeply concerning. But I think for companies, being responsive to that and mindful of that is actually strategic and helpful to the resilience of our inclusion efforts. In most cases, I think there's a spectrum there. I don't think there's a specific profile by company or by industry that's more likely to pull back from others. I would look at, how well the executive team really understood this work in the first place and was really aligned with the specific initiatives the company was engaged in. So if you were doing a bunch of stuff that your executive team just sort of didn't care about and was like, okay, go do your DEI stuff, those things are probably going to be at risk if threats emerge. But if you had an executive team that really understood, why do we have these programs? Why are we doing these things? I think those are the types of teams that are going to be better equipped to take more of like a scalpel than like a sledgehammer and say, okay, we do need to evolve some of these programs. We need to be responsive. But to say we're going to cut all DEI efforts and stop pride and stop our environmental sustainability, it was just like, whoa, 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 you clearly had no idea why you were doing this in the first place.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I do think that those those questions of where you stand on these issues as a company can 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 evolve and be shaped when you're challenged. And so I always like to leave space for people because I think that's more of a journey than right? Like figuring out what you stand for is actually a journey. And I would suggest that it's a lifelong journey. I'm talking about the individual level. But really companies are made up of individuals. And what I've seen in the corporate landscape is that this is a deeply personal it gets deeply personal even at the executive level, and so, it can be a very hard thing to navigate as an executive team, and as a company because it's not a single entity with a single consciousness, even though that's what you're striving towards, and so, I guess what I would love to see is, um I think, sure, we can scrutinize, we can analyze, we can be critical, and I think that's important, we should be. I also think we need forgiveness for people to change and find their way, because if we make it kind of back to your reflections, right? Like, if we make it hard for people to have the room to change, then they tend to entrench.
I think not villainizing,
Yeah,
people and companies, I don't think that's, particularly helpful for anyone. But I think it's important to, some organizations are going to have to stand up for their values. And I think it's just been
yeah,
interesting how afraid and how reactive some companies feel that they need to be to, conservative attacks and seem to forget that there are many people, groups, organizations on the other side of things, like the
yeah,
National Black Farmers
yeah,
Association. Yes, you can get civil rights lawsuits, for quote unquote reverse discrimination, followed by filed by white men, for sure that's a risk, but, you know, you can also get class action litigation filed by people from underrepresented groups as you start to roll back these programs and you start to see massive discrimination reemerge against women and, candidates from underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds. I think it's short-sighted to react to the loudest voices on the internet. I think it was short-sighted in 2020 and 2021 to do that and suddenly make DEI your top corporate agenda, and I think it's short-sighted now.
yeah, yeah. No, that's fair. I wanna move on to something a little bit different now. I'd love to talk about employee resource groups for a moment, because they really sprung up after 2020. They're not new, right? They've been around for a very long time. Um, and employee resource groups, are called ERGs, voluntary employee-led groups that aim to foster this inclusive workplace. They're typically formed around an identity or purpose of some sort. So your Black Employee Network, your caregivers group, veterans, pride groups. And so groups like these are not often considered the most strategic DEI investment because they're not seen as the company doing the work. And so we actually put out some research this spring showing that more than half of companies are increasing their ERG budgets. And our hypothesis is that this is because these groups have actually been really successful in strengthening employee belonging and workplace culture and really enabling companies to react more thoughtfully to crises, which, there's more now than we've ever experienced. They're also acting as channels for new business and new markets, like you were referring to earlier. So it's not often that you can find programs and companies that can do so much for a business in so many different ways. So uh, we've described ERGs as quote unquote climbing the corporate ladder. They're getting more important in terms of their strategic influence and value to the business. And I'd just love to hear what you might be seeing on this front, Joelle. Are they the next major power source? Is the pendulum swinging? Are they untapped? for their potential.
It's so interesting. I think this is like a very complex topic because I think a lot of the, negative reactions to employee resource groups are, I think, due to the fact that these groups are not always run effectively. And so it is true that, ERGs often aren't aligned to the needs and the strategy of the business and are sort of running on their own. It's true that if they're not run effectively, it can feel exclusive to people that aren't a part of them. It's true that it can sometimes exacerbate rather than minimize the concerns of members. That can happen. Um, and I think, it can also lead to a lot of burnout for the people that are leading these groups if not managed effectively. So I think a lot of people are reacting to that have negative views of ERGs, also called BRGs, other types of things. I think the negative view can often happen to people who have seen examples of these groups not being run effectively, which I think is actually fairly common. I think, on the other hand, I think these groups are incredibly effective if run well for doing things like helping companies find and attract diverse talent. There's research saying that a large majority of people, especially young people, have said they'd be more likely to apply for a role at a company that had ERGs. So a lot of job applicants are looking for the existence of these groups in companies. I think they can also help you quickly onboard and very quickly build a sense of belonging for people from underrepresented backgrounds. A recent report found that 54% of organizations with ERGs saw an increase in belonging, and 14% saw an increase in retention for people from underrepresented backgrounds who are part of these groups. As you said, it can help you enter new markets. I also think one thing that often isn't considered is they can help you create a more productive outlet for people talking about the challenges they face at work. I sometimes hear executives express this concern that if we have ERGs, people are going to go talk about the things they're not happy about. It's like people are for sure going to talk about the things they're not happy about. It's just where and how they do it. Do you want them doing it in Slack channels or forming, unsupported groups or, doing it in ways that are very toxic to your culture? Or do you want to create an outlet where people actually feel empowered to change the things that they might have feedback on? Like that seems like a way healthier way to approach thinking about organizational challenges. But I think, n- again, like the effectiveness of how these groups are run matters. So, do ERGs have engaged executive sponsors? Do they have strong relationships with the people or DEI team? Do they have a charter and structures? Do they have clear objectives of what goals they want to accomplish and how? Who's responsible for organizing meetings? I think charters are really, really important for creating this structure. Um, who are the people leading the ERGs? How are they upskilled? Um, and then, what are the types of things that they're actually doing for the organization? I think when organizations can build these playbooks and implement these structures and drive this kind of alignment, I think ERGs can be a really, really powerful part of organizational culture. Now, they're no replacement for structural and systemic change driven by your people team. Like you still need to think about how are we evolving our talent practices, our people practices. But ERGs can actually give you a point of view also on how to do some of those things or give you feedback on policies, organizational norms. So you know, I think on balance, these groups can add a ton of value to organizations. And I just think it's important to not like put them into place or run them haphazardly, to do it very intentionally and thoughtfully. And then I think you can unlock all sorts of benefits.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, and I think providing the structure, the governance, and also the tools, right, to be for them to be successful because, if those ERGs aren't successful, I think it can just, um, reinforce the challenges of belonging that already exist within many of these communities and
I've seen
groups,
that
so
too. I've seen that too. And
yeah.
I think organizations that have ERGs should be asking, do people who are part of our ERGs have a different experience here in our organization than people with shared identities who are not part of these groups? Do they see, like, if you did that and you saw people felt a lower sense of belonging for being in ERGs, that would be very bad. But if you saw the opposite, which is what I suspect in most organizations, that people that are members of these groups, maybe they perform better, maybe they feel a stronger sense of belonging, maybe they feel more engaged. That's just really helpful data to have before you start to even develop an opinion about whether these groups are helpful or not. I think starting to have the data, and we've seen a lot of data that suggests they are very helpful.
Yeah, yeah, same here. And I think the other thing that can often be underestimated is how humanizing they can be for groups that you don't interact with in your own day to day life because you've got a, not such a diverse social circle. it can actually I've found ERGs tremendously powerful, for me anyways, to expose and humanize, different life experiences and people from different backgrounds because, the storytelling and the sharing, in that safe space can be very profound. So, I think that sometimes we underestimate how transformative that can be for at the individual level, and then you associate that with the company that you work for. At that company, I actually became aware of these things, and it helped me learn these things. Now I'm a better person. But speaking of being a better person, I'd love to end, our conversation, by sharing very honestly that sometimes I feel like by, maybe seeing both sides of a conflict or being curious or empathetic to both sides or trying to understand and not necessarily either picking a side or being really vocal that you're not considered a good DEI leader or maybe not even a good ally or a good person. And I just, we talked about what it feels like to make people feel like they're bad people. And I think that sometimes people carry guilt because they're not maybe as vocal or they're not advocating as vocally. And I'm just curious, right? It's like as though we only accept one profile of someone who fights for equity and justice, and that someone who vocally denounces bad behavior is a good person. I mean, it feels very binary to me, but um I just love your perspective. Is speaking out always the best way to actually drive behavioral or belief change? Like, what advice would you leave us with? To get what advice would you give to both people and business leaders on how to think about what doing the right thing actually looks like?
I don't think leaders or organizations need to speak out on every single issue that touches on justice, inclusion, identity, diversity. I think every leader and organization should think about, and organizations more formally than individuals probably, developing a framework for themselves on what topics they will have a point of view on and why. I think that can help give people, teams, sort of a north star on why they want to comment. And I don't think the absence of a comment on a specific topic. There's a lot of you know, activism online that assumes that because someone hasn't said something on a particular topic, they must feel a certain way. I don't think most people owe you their opinion on every topic. I just don't think that's a reasonable thing to assume. People have whole entire lives and companies have whole entire sort of context that we aren't privy to. And so I don't start with the assumption that I can possibly know what's in an organization's or a leader's mind on a given topic. And I don't think everyone has to speak out on everything. I also think words without action can be worse than saying nothing at all. I'm far more interested in what people and organizations are doing than what statements they're putting out. Um, and then I do think when you have strong opinions on something, putting out a statement is really can be really powerful, especially if you're aligning your behavior to that statement. I know that when the Roe v. Wade decision came down, I it was helpful for me as, like, a woman in the world to see so many companies put out statements about how they were gonna continue to support their employees, in accessing the healthcare that they needed. Like, that was very meaningful to me, and I consulted and advised a lot of companies that did not put out statements. Even, I remember consulting with, some women CEOs who felt very strongly on this topic personally, but did not feel like it was in the best interest of their organization um, or them to put out statements on this particular topic. And so I just think we can't make any assumptions. I think we can, still have things we would like to see as humans. Like as a human, I wish every company put out a statement on that. It would feel really good for me. And yet I understand that that's not in the strategic interest of every leadership team and every company. So I just think we can do a little bit less of a there's a lot of debate on this, assume good intent. And I think, people can reasonably disagree whether the default should be to assume good intent, but I certainly don't think it should be to assume bad intent. And, I try to lead with curiosity and just assume that I don't know. Like, if someone's not saying something, I can't possibly know why that is, but I can assume there's probably context that I don't have access to. And I think that's like a good way to live our lives is to assume that there's things going on that we don't have full context around. And I think that can just sometimes help us not infer the worst of people and of organizations.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful. I think not assuming silence means lack of support is actually really powerful. And then if you are going to judge, judge based on action. not just on words. I think that, action backing up statements is really what builds trust. And I think that's kind of actually what we've been circling around. We haven't used the word once this conversation, but ultimately I think that um when you have integrity, when you have alignment, values between your statements and your actions, between your values and your actions, you aren't changing with the weather. I think that you become more trusted. And I think when you're known as a fair place or a diverse, equitable, and inclusive space, you are much more likely to foster trust. And I think trust is one of those things that society could just use a hell of a lot more of right now. So, Joelle, thank you so much for sharing your perspective.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.